So today we're just reading two verses in Colossians chapter 4, that's verses 12 and 13. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ, saluteth you, always labouring fervently for you in prayers, that ye may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. For I bear him record that he hath a great zeal for you and them that are in Laodicea and them in Hierapolis. So, how do you pronounce the name of this man? When I first read the name in the Bible, I thought that it was Epaphras. But then I heard Albert McShane from Lurgan pronouncing it as Epaphras. I thought that sounded really peculiar, but if you have a Bible that shows you how to pronounce names, you'll find out that Mr. McShane was right, and that'll hardly come as a surprise. Epaphras is mentioned 3 times in Scripture, twice in Colossians and once in Philemon. Philemon was a resident of Colossae, so he probably knew Epaphras, who also came from that city. In fact, the phrase that we read in verse 12, who is one of you, suggests that that was the case. It's a similar name to Epaphroditus, who's mentioned 3 times in Philippians, but it's unlikely to have been the same person. The name actually means lovely, and he certainly was a lovely character. Epaphras was probably not well known outside of his local circle. He may not have been a particularly public man, but he made a real impact for God in Colossae. And I am certain that the health of any local assembly owes more to the input of local Christians than it does to visitors, valuable though their contribution might be. Epaphras was such a man. There are 3 ways in which Paul describes him. In verse 1 of chapter 1, he's called a fellow servant. He's also called a faithful minister in that verse. And then in verse 2, where we read, he's called a fervent labourer. That's quite a description from the apostle. When we think of Epaphras as a fellow servant, it underlines that he was a support, particularly for the apostle Paul in chapter 1. He calls him our dear fellow servant. Some of us love the limelight, but Epaphras was willing to play a supporting role. It's of great value. King David in the Old Testament recognized that when he made it an ordinance in Israel that as his part is that goeth down to the battle, so shall his part be that tarrieth by the stuff. They shall part alike. You see, we all need support. It's great when people give it. In relation to his faithful ministry, I think of his stewardship or just simply his service. I know that it's a different word in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, but in that passage, Paul tells us that it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. And the approval of the Lord in Matthew 25 was, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Epaphras was faithful to the Lord in his service, and he was faithful to the Colossians too. When it comes to his fervent labour, the feature that I see in Epaphras is selflessness. When Paul first mentioned Epaphras, he wrote this, Epaphras, who is for you. And then when he writes about him in verse 12 here, he says, Epaphras, who saluteth you, and again, who labours fervently for you, and then that ye might stand perfect. And in verse 13, he has a great zeal for you. That last phrase shows us that he must have given himself tirelessly for the benefit of the Christians. It was what the Lord called him to do, and it's how the Lord expects us to act in our me-focused world. Paul closes the letter with another exhortation, and we'll look at that in our final video in this little series.